Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about Karen, who created a new HOA. I never thought one person's obsession with control would overshadow my weekend ritual of trimming hedges, sipping lemonade, and chatting with easygoing neighbors. But that happened when Karen, a new resident on our street, announced she was forming a homeowners association. She initially framed it as a way to maintain cleanliness, order, and minor improvements to shared spaces. I noticed trouble when she said, "I will make sure every neighbor joins. They have to follow the rules, and this is non-negotiable." I like cleanliness, but I didn't think my quiet cul-de-sac needed a dictator. Friendly waves, lawnmower noise disputes, and community barbecues were our street's norm. I didn't realize Karen's plan would threaten my property rights and sanity. Most people in my neighborhood are quiet but willing to help a neighbor. If someone is out of town, the neighbor collects their mail. A minimum of 3 people will help catch a dog that escapes its leash. I came here because of the friendly atmosphere. We never formally partnered. Trust and civility just worked. Karen apparently thought that wasn't enough. She campaigned door to door in her sweetest voice about beautifying our block entrance, organizing holiday lights, and possibly getting discounted trash pickup. She initially excited a few with promises of new street lamps and safer sidewalks. Many neighbors signed up immediately, but some later told me they felt pressured to stay because backing out would look unneighborly. I listened politely and asked questions about her pitch. I wondered if the group was voluntary or required dues. She inhaled, smiled, and said minor monthly fees would keep things sustainable. I also asked if the HOA would eventually regulate landscaping and house color. Karen almost seemed offended. "I don't want to control your property," she said, as if to a child. "Just make sure everything is perfect. Let me assure you of the benefits." I wished her luck and promised to let her know if I joined, even though I wasn't convinced. She became cold when I said that. She pulled a folder from her arm. She gently patted the folder, saying, "I'll leave you with this information. But once everyone's joined, latecomers may have to pay extra." She left with a tight smile. Karen visited several houses over the next few weeks, which I watched from my living room window. I saw her return looking happy at some stops and annoyed at others. Jordan, my 3-door down neighbor, said Karen tried to corner her while unloading groceries. Karen insisted Jordan sign the HOA documents immediately, nearly blocking her front door. Jordan, who was clearly annoyed and had her hands full of groceries, politely declined to sign anything until she had time to read the papers. Karen complained about people who don't understand the necessity of community standards, then left. Karen knocked on Jordan's door again the next day, refusing to leave until she opened. Apparently, Jordan joined to get Karen off her back. It made me uneasy when she said that. If Karen could bother one of our street's more assertive residents, she wouldn't give up on anyone else. Karen returned to my house as usual. She came with Bryce, a mild-mannered neighbor who had joined Karen's group. Bryce spoke softly about the benefits of membership, including shared road maintenance costs, a more structured approach to yard work, and the chance to organize holiday events. I nodded but said I wasn't rushing to sign. Karen reverted to her pushy ways. "We're already at about 60% participation," she said, opening a clipboard. "We aim for 100%. The benefits will become apparent when everyone cooperates." Something was ominous about her tone and how she said cooperates. Karen lost patience when I politely requested more time. "If you don't join," she said, "I can't guarantee you'll be pleased with how this all turns out." She turned and left. Bryce mumbled an apology and followed her, leaving me on my porch with a tight chest. As time went on, I discovered that 65% of our neighbors had signed up. Although none of them were thrilled, Karen was so persistent that they mostly gave in. Some thought structure was better than risking property value drops. I wouldn't be bullied into giving up my property autonomy. I don't want someone to regulate my grass length because I like my house's color and yard. I pride myself on neatness, but I don't need external pressure. I insisted on remaining independent whenever Karen, or her HOA deputies, as I called them, came by. I even posted a small "no soliciting" sign on my door in hopes she would stop. She didn't. The first fine arrived in my mailbox soon. The envelope read HOA notice and looked official. I received a typed letter saying I owed for not meeting standards. The letter listed some lawn ornament nonsense, including my front yard's small decorative spinner as unapproved. I don't remember seeing rules about that in her initial proposal, and I never agreed to any of her terms. Unless the fine was paid within 10 days, additional charges would be added, the letter warned. It was absurd, so I laughed. How could anyone find me? I never signed any agreement. It went in the recycle bin. The next day, my neighbor Jarvis arrived at my door worried. The envelope from Karen's HOA was nearly identical. Jarvis joined the association hesitantly, expecting benefits, but now he was being fined for leaving his garbage bin on the curb an extra day. Ironically, our city's trash collection sometimes ran late, so we had to bring our bins in the next morning. Jarvis felt trapped. He didn't want to pay that fine, but joining the HOA bound him to those strange new rules. Though I felt sorry for him, it made me even more determined to never join. Karen had trapped her members and was extorting them under community order. What I didn't expect was how far Karen would go to force non-members. 7 notices from her self-styled HOA arrived in 2 days. Each cited a different infraction. My mailbox was the wrong style. My flower bed was improperly landscaped. My car tires were treading on the grass, etc. It was absurd. It was hilarious that I had never signed a contract with her, so none of this made legal sense. However, these letters threatened increasing fines, liens, and legal action if I continued my willful disregard for community norms. I might have laughed if it weren't so annoying to watch her brazenly intimidate me. I met my attorney cousin Toby that week. We discussed life, work, and local gossip at a family gathering. I had to tell him about my bizarre HOA situation. He raised an inquisitive eyebrow. He looked at one of my phone-saved letters and asked, "Wait, you never signed anything, right?" "No, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole," I said. Toby shook his head incredulously. "She's practicing law without a license by writing official-looking notices. That seems fraudulent, especially if she claims you're bound to terms you never agreed to. If she wants money, that's bad." Toby offered legal advice. If Karen tried to find me under false pretenses, I had a strong case if I needed to act. After Toby and I finished talking, I got a new letter the next day. It was a direct message from Karen, not just a fine. She wrote, "You have no right to refuse to join our HOA. Unless you register by the end of the week, these fines will increase." She also promised to cancel all fines if I joined immediately. Clumsy writing made it clear she was blackmailing me into compliance. She was wrong to think that would scare me. I gave Toby the letter, who read it twice and laughed. "You'll win without breaking a sweat if you file a lawsuit," he said. "We just need to do this right." Next, we wrote a small claims court complaint alleging harassment, false claims, and fraudulent fines. I've never fought, but home bullying annoys me. Karen showed up at my door the day after I wrote a short letter telling her she had no legal authority over me and that any further contact would be harassment. She shouted that I was ruining the neighborhood and demanded that the neighbors support her. Naturally, I recorded the entire interaction on my phone for safety. She threatened more fines, so I calmly told her I'd call the police if she didn't leave my property. She stomped off my porch, yelling that she wouldn't rest until I joined. The final straw. I decided then to sue and make sure she knew she couldn't violate my rights. Toby helped me file the paperwork at the county courthouse a few days later. We wanted the bogus harassment fines and damages stopped. Karen panicked after receiving the court notice. She spoke to me again in a more subdued tone, but I ignored her. I sent her to my lawyer. Toby said Karen called his office multiple times to justify her actions, saying she was trying to keep our street clean and tidy, but damage was done. She had no defense, and her threatening letters would hang her in court. Some neighbors began to complain about the fiasco, and some who had joined Karen's HOA wondered if they could leave. Unfortunately for her contract signers, the terms seemed deliberately restrictive. With monthly dues, they were trapped. Karen tried many methods to save her reputation in the weeks before court. She advertised a neighborhood get-together at a community center with flyers saying, "Come talk about how we can improve our block." Karen reportedly boasted about how many homes had newly trimmed hedges and how a small sidewalk was power washed for the first half of the meeting. In the second half, residents complained about piling random fines, sparking a heated argument. One elderly resident asked why he was fined for his granddaughter's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Karen said it was vandalism. The man claimed it was fun, washable chalk art for kids. After the meeting, several neighbors left in a huff, vowing not to pay again. Karen spent the night telling everyone they had signed a contract and couldn't leave. Despite all the tension, Karen's biggest worry was losing the lawsuit I filed, and it seemed to be affecting her actions. She was trying to appear more conciliatory after losing her bravado. However, she had left a paper trail of harassing letters, and her initial pushiness was well documented. Including her porch footage, I had them in a binder. I also had statements from neighbors who had witnessed her threatening me or been intimidated. Jarvis offered to testify in court if it showed Karen's pattern. Toby said that having so many witnesses wouldn't hurt, but it might not be necessary. I wore a simple shirt and slacks to the hearing to avoid drama. Toby arrived in his usual suit with the meticulously compiled evidence binder. Karen looked nervous as we waited outside the courtroom. She carried a haphazard stack of papers, as if she had spent the night putting together a defense. After glaring, she looked away. Since I had never taken anyone to court, I tried to stay calm. However, Toby assured me we had a solid case. Once our case was called, we presented the judge with the evidence of Karen's repeated fines and threatening letters. Karen tried to claim that she had the right to impose these fines because she believed it was for the betterment of the neighborhood. She argued that my refusal to join was a detriment to the community at large. The judge, however, was not impressed by this argument. He asked her point blank if I had ever signed any contract or legally binding document that obligated me to join her HOA. Karen admitted I had not. She tried to explain that she thought everyone on the block automatically becomes a member, but the judge cut her off, reminding her that automatic membership isn't valid unless there's a properly recorded covenant attached to the deeds, which wasn't the case here. I could see Karen's face growing red as the judge flipped through the letters she'd sent me. He shook his head, remarking that her written threats and repeated fines had no legal basis whatsoever. Then came the part where he asked me if I wanted to press for damages for harassment. Toby stepped in, calmly explaining the stress and anxiety I experienced, as well as how these attempts had disrupted my peaceful enjoyment of my property. We provided a reasonable figure, not something outrageous, just enough to underscore how serious her behavior had been. The judge nodded, took some notes, and then delivered his decision. He ruled in my favor, clearly stating that Karen had no authority to impose any fines on me or anyone else who hadn't voluntarily signed a legitimate HOA contract. He also awarded me a modest sum for damages, which Karen was required to pay within a specified time frame. Then he warned Karen that continuing such behavior could result in further legal consequences, including potential criminal charges if she persisted with unlawful threats or harassment. At that point, Karen looked visibly deflated. I almost felt a pang of pity, but that quickly dissolved when I recalled the months of intimidation and stress she'd inflicted on me and others. Emerging from the courtroom, I took a deep breath, relieved that it was over. Toby gave me a thumbs up, and I thanked him profusely for his help. As we walked out, Karen hurried up behind me with a last-ditch appeal. She mumbled something about how she was just trying to do what was best for everyone, and that I could still join the HOA if I wanted to. I politely declined, reminding her that the court had just established how baseless her fines were. She opened her mouth to retort but hesitated, shook her head, and walked away. And with that, I thought the entire ordeal might finally be behind me. Surprisingly, though, the repercussions were far from over. For Karen, that is. A few days after the hearing, Jarvis told me that the neighbors who had signed up were now more emboldened to challenge Karen's rules. Some were refusing to pay further dues until Karen could show them official documents proving her right to impose fees. At the next HOA meeting, which I obviously didn't attend, a small rebellion took place. Several members demanded transparency about how funds were being used, citing that Karen had been collecting dues for months, with little to show for it, aside from a few trifling changes. While I don't know all the details, I heard that things got heated when Karen couldn't produce adequate receipts or financial statements. Suspicion arose that she might have been using some of those dues for her own personal expenses, like that flashy new mailbox she had installed, or the landscaping work around her property that looked far more luxurious than any community area we supposedly shared. That debacle led a handful of neighbors to consult attorneys of their own, questioning the validity of the contracts they'd signed. Rumors floated around that Karen had been misleading about certain clauses, failing to disclose terms about penalties, and even forging some signatures. I can't vouch for the authenticity of those rumors, but the overall sentiment was that Karen's entire HOA endeavor was on shaky legal ground. Eventually, some members banded together to elect new leadership, or at least demand a formal process for selecting an HOA board. Karen resisted at first, but with all the negative attention, she was losing her support base rapidly. Meanwhile, life on my end started returning to normal. Without Karen's letters piling up in my mailbox, I could finally enjoy a peaceful weekend again. I got back to my usual routine of mowing my lawn, chatting with Jordan about the latest yard project and waving to passing neighbors. I did keep my eyes open for any further signs of Karen's meddling, but for a while, she seemed to be lying low, probably licking her wounds after that court loss. I also heard from Toby that Karen did, in fact, pay the court-mandated damages. It arrived a bit later than the due date, but at least it arrived. One unexpected side plot that emerged during all of this was the case of my friend Adriana, who lives in the next block over. She had heard about my predicament and came forward with an unusual twist. Apparently, Karen had been trying to extend her HOA beyond just our street, luring nearby residents with talk of synergy and broader community improvement. Adriana received a letter suggesting she hop on board early before the fees went up. That's right. Karen was effectively branching out, turning her little pet project into some kind of mini empire. But Adriana, who works in real estate, knew enough about property law to see the red flags immediately. She actually sent Karen a formal cease and desist letter, warning her not to misrepresent the nature of her supposed homeowners association to other properties that had no legal tie to it. That apparently shut down Karen's expansion plan rather abruptly, as Adriana's letter was thorough and left no wiggle room for Karen. In the midst of this drama, another neighbor named Lorna found herself dealing with Karen's meddling in a different context. Lorna was planning to build a small deck extension in her backyard. Ordinarily, one would just file the relevant permit with the city and follow the local building codes. But Karen insisted that as a member of her HOA, Lorna needed to submit an additional form for aesthetic review, along with a hefty fee for the board's consideration. Lorna had enough sense to consult the city directly, only to learn that there was no requirement to get permission from an HOA for that type of construction in our county, especially not an HOA formed so haphazardly. Once Lorna realized that Karen was essentially pocketing these review fees, she was enraged. She demanded her money back, and Karen feigned ignorance. That entire confrontation wound up pushing Lorna to join the small group of neighbors trying to remove Karen as the head of the association. By now, it was clear that Karen's empire was crumbling. She could hardly walk outside without encountering someone furious at her for one reason or another. I started hearing rumors that she was thinking of selling her house and moving away. Some neighbors who wanted to maintain a coherent HOA, albeit a fair one, actually hoped she would leave, so they could restructure everything from the ground up with real bylaws, transparency, and a democratically elected board. While I wasn't eager to join an HOA regardless of who ran it, I couldn't deny that the idea of a properly structured association with real checks and balances might be more reasonable than the chaos Karen had introduced. However, I kept a healthy distance, focusing on my own property and enjoying the quiet that returned once Karen toned down her harassment. Sure enough, a sign reading "House for Sale" popped up on Karen's front lawn about 2 months after the lawsuit ended. Her once pristine yard looked somewhat neglected, possibly because she was drained from the ongoing disputes. Neighbors whispered that she might have trouble finding a buyer willing to take on a property entangled in so much controversy. Some speculated that she'd try to spin it positively, claiming she'd established a wonderful HOA and that the buyer would be stepping into a well-maintained community. But the truth was out there, and most people on the street were more than willing to inform potential buyers of the real situation. In the end, Karen eventually sold her house, but not without a steep price reduction. The new owners, a friendly couple named Delia and Ross, had zero interest in continuing any part of Karen's dysfunctional HOA. They politely told the neighbors they were there to start fresh and had no intention of policing lawn ornaments or handing out fines. Shortly before Karen officially left, I encountered her one last time. I was walking my dog along the sidewalk when I saw her loading boxes into a moving truck. For a moment, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. This woman had caused so much strife, tried to bully people into signing documents under duress, and then hammered them with fake fines when they didn't comply. Yet she also looked tired and worn down, as though the entire fiasco had aged her. She glanced at me and gave a half-hearted wave. Part of me wanted to walk over and say something, maybe a final goodbye, but I decided there was nothing worth saying. She had created the mess, inflicted stress on the neighborhood, and forced me to sue her just to preserve my rights. Now she was facing the consequences of her actions. That felt like enough closure for me. After Karen moved, I thought the saga was finally done. But a few months later, I received a letter from the law office representing some of the former HOA members. Apparently, they were building a class action case against Karen for misappropriation of funds, forging documents, and other financial irregularities. They asked if I had any pertinent evidence that might help them. While I had plenty of letters from Karen, none pertained to internal HOA finances, so I respectfully declined. Still, it was a testament to how deeply she had dug herself into trouble. Word on the street was that Karen tried to fight back, claiming she had done everything by the book. But her lack of documentation and contradictory statements made her look worse at every turn. I never heard the final outcome, but the overall feeling was that the neighbors would eventually see some restitution. As for me, I learned a valuable lesson about standing up for my property rights. It's easy to assume that someone trying to form a neighborhood association has legitimate authority, or that refusing them might alienate you from your neighbors. But in the end, it's crucial to know where you stand legally and to be firm when you have valid reasons to say no. Through this ordeal, I discovered that many neighbors respected my position, even if they had been hesitant to speak up themselves. Sometimes, all it takes is one person drawing a line in the sand to inspire others to question what they're being pushed to accept. The aftermath of Karen's departure left the neighborhood in a state of cautious optimism. The revised HOA group, led by a small committee of volunteer residents, tried to set up transparent rules. They even consulted a real estate attorney to draft legitimate bylaws, ones that wouldn't infringe on basic property rights. I was invited to some of their open meetings just to provide an outside perspective. I commended them for wanting to create a fair system, but I remained non-committal. However, I did notice that some of the new ideas, like collectively hiring a snow removal service or organizing community events, were done with genuine neighborly intentions rather than intimidation. When it came time to vote on bylaw changes, the new HOA leadership made sure that only people who had signed a proper agreement were bound by the rules. Those of us who chose to remain outside of it were not subject to any fines or obligations. It was a night and day difference from Karen's reign of terror. Life eventually settled back into a peaceful rhythm. The memory of Karen's relentless campaign to reach 100% HOA membership faded into something of a cautionary tale among us. When new residents move in, they inevitably hear whispers about the fiasco, and it serves as a reminder that neighborly cooperation must come from genuine consent, not forced compliance. I continue to keep my lawn tidy out of personal pride and not because anyone is holding a fine over my head. Now, when I see neighbors with yard decorations or interesting paint choices, I appreciate the variety. It reminds me that individuality is part of what makes a community vibrant. One particularly poignant epilogue involved Jarvis, the neighbor who had joined the HOA early on and found himself facing petty fines for leaving his trash bin out. After Karen left, Jarvis approached me one day and said, "I should have stood with you from the start. I regret not doing so." I told him not to worry. He was hardly the only one who felt pressured into joining. We had a friendly chat about how the new HOA leadership had eliminated all the old silly rules about chalk drawings and mailbox shapes, focusing instead on real community improvements. Jarvis apologized for some earlier tension when I was refusing to join, and we parted with a handshake, or rather a friendly elbow bump. It felt good to know that we could put the past behind us. Another little subplot I discovered months later involved Bryce, the mild-mannered neighbor who initially joined Karen on her rounds. Bryce confided that he had felt cornered by Karen from the beginning. She'd singled him out, telling him his house's exterior color was too bright and that she could help him avoid hefty penalties if he showed solidarity and helped her persuade others to join. Bryce had been practically coerced into becoming her poster boy, even though he was never entirely comfortable with her methods. He felt so guilty afterward that he apologized to several neighbors for leading Karen to their doors. Nobody held a grudge against him because we all knew Karen's manipulative style was behind it. His story reminded me just how complex these situations can become when someone with an authoritative streak takes advantage of people's fears. By the time a full year rolled around after the lawsuit, the neighborhood had mostly returned to a tranquil place where people's biggest worries were the occasional barking dog or the kids playing too close to the street. I sometimes reflect on how bizarre it was to receive 7 fines in 2 days for infractions that weren't even real. It still makes me shake my head, and I won't forget the moment in court when the judge looked at those letters, paused, and said, "There's simply no legal basis for this." I remember catching a glimpse of Karen's expression. It was a cocktail of anger, embarrassment, and desperation, all rolled into one. It was the perfect illustration of what happens when you try to wield power you don't actually possess. Even though the lawsuit was successful and she was barred from demanding I join, the real satisfaction came from protecting my property rights. After the dust settled, I realized I had never owed her an explanation. I didn't sign any agreement, so I had no obligation to adhere to her version of standards. The legal system backed me up on that. I suppose the moral is that no matter how intimidating someone may seem, if your position is grounded in fact and law, you have every right to defend yourself. And sometimes that defense sets a precedent that helps others who felt powerless at first. Occasionally, I still get a reminder of the fiasco. Like when I check my mailbox and see a flyer about a new community improvement plan, I smile to myself, remembering the time when Karen tried to bully me into submission. Now I can look at these flyers and decide of my own free will if I want to support any initiative, without the specter of fines or enforced compliance hanging over my head. There's a certain peace in that freedom, and I cherish it. Before I wrap up this story, I just want to highlight one more small, amusing footnote. About a week ago, we had our annual neighborhood barbecue. The new HOA committee helped organize it, and I was invited even though I'm not a member. The potluck spread was fantastic and folks mingled easily, talking about everything from summer vacations to local sports. Not a single person brought up lawn care regulations or mailbox uniformity. In a way, this was the first time in over a year that I felt we'd truly come together as neighbors, free from drama and forced compliance. As the sun set, a few kids drew chalk hearts on the sidewalk, and I overheard an older neighbor chuckle. "I guess someone would have fined them for that last year." We both laughed. It felt like our neighborhood had finally healed from the chaos Karen brought. That's pretty much where things stand. Karen no longer has any say in what I do with my property, and after winning the lawsuit, she has no right to demand that I join her ill-fated HOA. The neighborhood is slowly getting back to normal, and those who remain part of a legitimate association do so willingly. I've learned that the best communities are built on trust and mutual respect, not on intimidation or empty legal threats. I hope that wherever Karen ended up, she realized that controlling people through fear is no way to foster real community. For now, I'm just grateful to enjoy my lawn, my porch swing, and my decorative spinner in peace. Friends, thank you. See you soon.